Class 7, our last class before spring break. And tonight we're going to work with a requirement, and this is what we will be doing when you come back from spring break. We'll work more and more on building systems that'll do some work for us. So tonight what we're going to take a look at is a very simple file system. Now I can see some of you are out on D2L trying to force the program to open. There are two reasons generally I won't open the slides up early in a class. One, I'm giving a quiz. You already had the quiz tonight. Second is I want you to listen for the first half of the lecture, and then we'll do the second half should we decide to do that. So we're going to build a simple file system tonight, and we're going to get more into using what we've learned in the last 7 weeks about Python and its different operations. So our first requirement, you can read that on your own. Pretty standard requirement. Everybody comfortable with it? Have some kind of feeling for what our simple file system will do. Let's go to the next one. So what would our pseudocode look like? Good thing to contemplate. Had I not already given you a quiz, this would have been a good point for a quiz, but we'll bypass that. So create a menu, driven file, create, access, and modify system using Python. The menu system will allow the end user to create, update, search, append, and delete text and CSV files. Users will also have the ability to search for files on the local computer drive. And I'm not going to make you do that tonight. We all want to get out early, correct? Yes. Yeah, okay. I heard a couple yeses, so at least 3 of us want to get out early tonight. All right. So, if we look at the requirement, what are the current menu items based on that requirement that we're going to use? So the first one we know is exit. Buyer's philosophy. I always put exit at the beginning of my menus. That way the end user knows where it is, they know how to exit a system, and they make fewer mistakes that way. Also, I never use letters in my menu system. I always use numbers. A user can't get confused over 0, well, they could. 0, 1, 2, 3. Never say never when you're programming. But they can get confused if we use exit and we tell them to enter the first letter of each word. Then the question becomes, well, is it a small e or an uppercase E? And we have to write the code to account for all of that. So using a number in a menu system is much, much easier. How do I want you to do it in class? Use the way that you think fits your programming style the best, but make sure when I run your program that if I enter a wrong value, it's going to be able to account for that or handle that. Next, we want to select a file. We just go right down to requirements and pick what the requirement is and list that as our menu. Then we're going to read a file, then append a file, then create a file, find the data in a file, and delete a file. That's probably enough. So to start off, we'd open up a template in Python. Don't do that tonight. Practice this when you're laying on the beach in Montenegro sipping pina colada over spring break. We have a definition. We can fill that in. We know that we're going to have to open a file somewhere along the way, so we create a variable called myFile. So far, that's pretty easy to start with and very easily to follow through on the requirement. The next thing we know is we have actually 7 different options that we're going to work with. We already know what they are. Let's do the easy stuff first. So I'm going to create a variable called myMenu. Then I'm going to prompt the end user for an input. Notice how I've done this. \n to create a new line for each menu item, then a number, a space, and then a definition of what that number select is. Very, very easy to do. We have the information to do it. Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. Notice at the end of the menu, I drop down 2 blank lines, and then I prompt the end user, select a menu number, and press enter. So they know exactly what they need to do when they get this far down in the menu. So now we've got a couple things accomplished. We've created a variable that's going to create that we'll use to open our file with, and we have a feeling for what the menu looks like. Next, we can start to fill in how we're going to handle the different selections. Right now, the way we're setting up our menu, the easiest way to do it with a series of if statements or if-else statements, either way it works fine. Totally up to you. So for my first item, we already know how we're going to code that. If my menu is equal to 0, then exit. Now we know also we probably want to put a file closed, my file closed, in there once we get everything up and running. But for right now, this pretty much fulfills filling out the first menu selection item. And the whole idea about designing your software this way is that we're putting together what we know, we're going to be able to test it, and then we'll go on to the harder things. Get the simple things out of the way first, get them tested, and then move on step by step to the harder processes. Well, we go to the next menu item, which is 1, and again, we've got an option. We can use an else if, like I did for flow control, or we could use an if statement. Either one is perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable. It's what you as a programmer are most comfortable with. And I highly recommend that you start building that profile of yourself as a programmer in this course. It'll help you as you go forward. Now, we really don't know what we're going to do with menu item 1 yet. We've got a name for it, but we don't really know how we're going to proceed. So we can use a Python reserved word called pass. And all pass does is exit us out to the next code. All right, so it's kind of a placeholder, if you will. So we'll use pass when we don't know what kind of code or have an idea of where our code's going to be at this point. Well, then we can proceed to 2, and we do the same thing, and then proceed with the rest of the menu, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then we might want to throw an else statement in there. And our else statement would be anything else that's entered, close the file, which we'll do in a little bit, and then exit out of the system. We're going to put this in for now, but we want to talk about it a little bit later and make sure that's exactly what we want to do at line 33. Well, once we've got our test code written, There we are. We're putting myfile.close. So the way 34, 35, and 36 work, and actually starting at 33, if they just hit enter, the system's going to exit automatically, which could be a good or bad thing. Again, we'll talk about that later. So here's the code. We talked about using if and else if as flow control statements. The other thing we need to look at is how long do we really want this menu to run? Well, the right answer is we want it to run until our end user is ready to quit. All right, so that means that we can encapsulate the whole thing in a while true statement, because we already know a while true statement will run how long? Forever, exactly, until we take some option to back out of it. So that's probably the best flow control setup we can have. So there's our entire piece of code. Actually, I put this code out in D2L for you to experiment with after class and over the holidays, or spring break, should you decide to do that. And here's what our system looks like when we run it. Pretty straightforward. We see how we exit. We see all of the different options that will eventually be available. And we see our prompt to the end user: select a number and press enter. In this case, the end user selected 1, and the process finished. Oh, the process went right back to the menu. Remember, we had a pass statement in there, so nothing will happen. This time, the end user selected 0, and you can see the result at the bottom of the screen. We finished up. So a very easy way, a very actually structured way to approach a requirement to build a system that has a menu. Now let's start to fill some of our menu in. Item number 2, we wanted to enter a file name. So we could set it up in this fashion. My file equals input with a prompt, enter a file name. Now, we're going to talk more about opening and closing files when you come back from spring break, and we always have to define a mode. So our mode in this case is going to be R for read, to open up the file to read only. Now all these are explained in I think it's chapter 5 in the textbook, and you can see the entire chart of file modes that we have available. So then we're actually going to open up the file with the mode, and we're calling that variable handle. So that's a very easy way, for 3 simple steps, to open up a file and prompt the end user for what the file name is that they want. Did you see any problems with that code? Right now we're opening a file up to read. That's all correct. The open statement's correct. Take a look at line 23. What could potentially be a problem with line 23? They don't know what the file extension is. Absolutely correct. So if we have control over that, if our requirements said build a file system that's based on text files, we can tell the end user to enter the file name only and let him know that .text will be automatically added. And we'll look at how we do that when we come back from spring break. So a little potential problem there, but right now, since we're the programmers and we know what we're doing, we'll leave it the way it is. Commercial break. Sometimes you want to print your code out in Python, either to bring it in and show me something, or maybe you want to take it with you. You're bored somewhere, and you want to look at the code without running it. Well, one of the things that we're able to do is print out either selected a module or a complete project in Python. I want to show you how to do that. First thing we do is go to the file system, and you open up file and you go almost to the bottom, and there's a print statement. And you click on that print statement, and that will bring up this menu. Now, there are a lot of things that we can do with the menu. Notice at the top, we've got selected File, Class 12.1 File System Menu. So that's what's going to be printed out. Notice also that we can print out selected text. So we may want to select 10 or 15 lines that we're having problems with and just print those lines out. Also, we could print all the files in that project folder. All right, so we've got several options there should we need to use them. Also, we can set our own header and footer on that printout, and we can do some advanced things. We're going to take a look at that in just a second. The other thing you need to make sure that you do if you're going to print something out for me to look at is show your line numbers and optionally draw a border around your code. If you draw a border around your code, that gives me an area to write some comments into you. By the way, this is not the way to turn your code in for a project. I want the files when we start doing more projects, but this might help you out. Down at the bottom, pretty much up to you, portrait, landscape, color, if you want to waste a color on it. And this is pretty much our setup menu for printing out Python files in PyCharm. Now let's look at the header and footer page. It's pretty simple. By default, it's going to give us the file name, it's going to give us a page number, and the total number of pages. That's not a bad default header footer system. You can go farther with it should you desire. Oh, by the way, down at the bottom, you can set the font sizes. I have mine set to Arial 8 as a default. In the advanced page, or tab, we can set whether or not we want a word wrap and where we want a word wrap should we want to do that. We can also set the top and bottom margins. And so once we've got all that done, we're comfortable with it. By the way, this is a set and forget print system. Once you get it set up the way you want it, that's the way it'll print out until you make a change. So that's kind of nice. It doesn't go back to default every time you start a new project. So we have everything we wanted. We click on print and we get a prompt to select what we want to print to. If you're sending files to me to look at or get commented on in the middle of a project, probably the best way to send them is a PDF file. And I'll answer specific questions, but things like, am I on the right track? Probably I'll respond back, I don't know. So I'm looking for specific questions if you send your file in. So standard printer selection page, select whatever you're going to print from. You click OK, and here's an example of a PDF printout using Foxit. So it pretty much prints out exactly what you have in the code window. In this one, I included the color so I could see what the different color prompts were and if there was any red on the screen or not. So it's a very, very slick way to print your code out. A lot of other interpreters don't print out nearly this well and this well defined. So it's a nifty tool to go ahead and work with. All right, let's go back and building our file system. So we put in an option for number 2 and how we're going to set it up. Let's take a look at the else if statement and the exit. So if my file is greater than 0, do we have a problem there? Yeah, we do. What did we do?
Canceled everything else out.
Well, we canceled everything else out, right, but what else did we do? We have a file that at this point is coded as a variable that's text. And so it's saying if the file is greater than 0. So right now, if you look at it, our else statement will not work. If
what?
no,
File size?
yeah, that's where the problem is. Okay, my arthritis isn't too good tonight, so assume that goes around the entire thing. What's happening here is the wrong variable was used. It should have been my menu up in as it is in line 32. But in line 35, it's my file. My file equals what? The open file statement that we used. So we'd probably get an error if that ever tried to activate. All right. So the example here is make sure you look at your code, and just because it runs doesn't mean that we don't have errors in it. I ran this code 3 or 4 times before I realized what I had done. So, and you can see there, it should have said my menu instead of my file. So here we are again. Here are our menu options. And I'm not seeing slides that are supposed to be in here. Okay, this fills out the next several segments of menu. Notice at number 3, we are appending, and that was part of our requirement. Let me see if anybody's looked at it in the textbook. What happens when we open a file with an R, a file mode of R? Read only, right. If we open it with an A, that means you can read it and append it, okay? How about if we open it with a W in menu item 4? You can write it, but what's the gotcha with that? I'm sorry, didn't catch that.
You can only write at the end.
Yeah, it'll write at the end. There's another gotcha.
If you do with the W, it's going to wipe out everything.
Right, if that file already exists, everything that you had there was gone. So you would want to use an append. Now, if you look in the book, you'll notice that we could also use an R plus or an A plus, and that would allow you to write even to a read file. And people think, well, I'll just use a plus sign with the W, and that will allow me to write to the write to the file. That is absolutely correct, but the W mode overrides the plus sign and it'll still erase everything that was there. So use the W file only when you're going to create a file, and use R or A and the plus sign as appropriate when you want to append a file or work with it. Now, we looked at this before, but again, just a reminder to you. If you notice, we've opened the file up, and now we're going to print \n. Handle is the file name, and we're going to read 1,024 characters, or a kilobyte of material. And when we do that, it should pretty much display one line at a time. There's not a whole lot more we can say about it. We open it up with a W and it recreates our file. And unfortunately, there's no local history save on this. When we erase a data file, it's gone forever. You do it a couple times and you learn. Now, notice line 42. We're setting up to input information into a file. We're going to use a while true statement. But how do you tell a while true statement you want to end when you're entering text? Well, the best way to do it is use a sequence of characters that normally will not appear in any text file that you might be creating. In this case, 3 number signs work extremely well. I started out as a journalist. That's the symbol for end of an article. When they used to set the articles in lead, they came to that sign and knew that that was the end of the article. There were no more pages after that. So it works pretty well. Very rarely, if ever, will you see 3 number signs in text in what we're working in. So that's an easy prompt. My new line that I'm going to write out to my file, input, enter text, or 3 number signs to quit. Works fairly well. Next thing we want to do, we want to use flow control and say if new line equals 3 number signs, then we're going to close the file. And that will write everything out to that file. Now, we still have the problem of the while true loop because we worked with it and we wanted to repeat our data entry as long as we could. So, once we get the code or the input for quitting the code, then notice the reserve word that we use to get out of the while true loop. It's called a break. And so break will take us out of that while true loop and back to the program. Depending on where you use the break, it could take you back to the menu or it could exit the program totally for you. And I'd recommend you play around with that when you get a chance. Now, if line 43 is false, then we'll jump down to line 46, and this is the way we write data out to our file. Handle, which is the actual file we're writing to, write, and the new line data. It's that simple. And we can now run the program, select a menu number, and we selected 4, enter a file name, easy for me to say, junk.txt. Again, we'll deal with that text extension when we come back from spring break. And enter the text or 3 number signs. I put in hello world. And then the second time I put in 3 number signs to quit. The next one I entered, let's see, where in the world is Waldo, and 3 number signs, and we quit.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Were we not supposed to put in a rewrite or a pen for the my mode you had earlier?
Right there, not line 39, we're writing.
Okay, that's not a user. But,
No, at this point it's not, because it's, let's go back a little further.
it's on
Whoops.
option 4.
It's a menu selection item. So we're going to create a file. Yeah. So we know we're going to write it. We're controlling it. We're not letting those doggone end users mess up our good code yet. Okay?
Makes sense.
Try and convince them sometimes. Yeah. All right, so if we look at our file that's been created, we open up the junk text and notice it's run everything together. Hello world, where in the world is Waldo? Any ideas on how we could fix that?
Escape key?
Pardon me?
Escape key? Are you talking about the separated out? Or?
Yeah, how would we want to make sure that where in the world is Waldo is on another line?
Escape key?
Escape sequence, yeah.
Like, was it backslash n?
Gold star, very good. \n. Or you could put it at the beginning. So notice the change to line 39. Now we're going to write out to the file, but this time we're going to include a blank line at the beginning of every new line that we start. So what's that going to do to our file? Our file will automatically have a blank line at the beginning of it. There are ways we can deal with that, but for now we're going to accept it. And so here's what we're going to enter this time. And notice that Marco now jumps down to a new line. Also notice that the menu item selected was 2. So we're writing, we're appending, we're not writing. That's why we didn't erase it. So these are the things that you have to work with. It all might be a little cloudy right now. We're going to look at it in a little more detail when we come back from spring break. But I didn't want you to carry the weight of having all this on your mind on spring break. There's a little better look at the file.
So when you put the escape characters in, you did not fix the hello world where?
No, I did not.
You just
I just added the next line down. Okay. Let's see. All right. I think we beat that one to death. And that's how we solved that problem. So, in roughly 40 minutes, we've created a menu, we've handled the code for exiting, for reading a file, for creating a file, and appending to a file. All right? So we've taken a requirement that's relatively involved, followed a simple process to work with it, and been able to accomplish quite a bit in 40 minutes. You're sitting there saying, right, I don't think I could do that. Well, I would expect you to take maybe 90 minutes to do that, to set this up. But by the time we get done with the semester, you'll be able to knock out these simple menu systems in a half hour or less. Trust me. Now, next thing we want to look at is library functions. And one of the primary library functions we want to look at in supporting our file system is the OS, the operating system. Now, this is usable with Python across all the platforms that we can use. So as an example, we're using Windows here in the lab. Some of you may be using a Mac version. Some of you may actually be using Linux. I doubt if anybody has a Unix box at home, but it could be possible. So at least for 4 different operating systems, we can, from Python, go in through the standard library and perform file actions. We do this by using an import statement, and we import operating system. Again, this is already coded in the Python standard library and allows us now to use the operating system to do several of the file transactions that we just did through Python. One of the neat things that we can do is we can determine a file path. We can determine where a file is living, on a hard drive, on a network drive, on a thumb drive that's plugged into the computer. We can also find out who's logged into that computer, should we desire to do that. More of something that I work with my scripting students on, but it's something we'll look at here in the classroom when we come back. Question?
So the language is going to be the same across every operating system?
The operating system languages will all be different, but the way Python is able to talk to that operating system and tell it how to do different file transactions. Where have I got you?
Oh, no,
Cloudy.
I was just wondering.
Okay. The way we talk in Python to the different systems is the same.
Is the same.
Python knows what kind of system it's on, so it knows how to interpret that system and go to its file functions, if you will. Hopefully that clears it up a little bit. Oh, and we can also play with something called the garbage collector. That comes later. So, if you want to learn about all that stuff, come back after spring break and everything will be revealed. And we'll probably have a quiz the second week we're back. Any questions on tonight's activities?